Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this meeting. Very special meeting, actually. This is the first of a new series of Monday lunchtime lectures or seminars for DCCC. I think it's going to be called the Monday Lunch Live Forum, is that right? So it's got a little particular ring about it. Many institutions, including Peter Mac and many others, have had this sort of program, but I think with the DCCC element to it, this is going to be a thriving and effective program which will be well populated over the year. So, for those who don't know me, I'm Bob Thomas. I am previously a surgical oncologist. I've been involved with the DCCC for many years when it was just a kernel in a few people's minds to what it is today. And I'm currently the Deputy Chair of the DCCC. I guess I'm standing in for Grant MacArthur, who is the, I don't like the word elect because it sounds like President-elect, which sounds like Mr. Trump. But Grant is the Executive Director-elect, if you like, or appointed, and he'll be taking up his role as the Executive Director of the DCCC in, I think, early April. So, welcome. The DCCC is a very particular organisation. We're at the end of phase 1. It's been going for about 7 years, but we're at the start of phase 2. And the DCCC is essentially something much more than a building. We've got a fantastic building here, which sort of like houses many of the partners of the DCCC. The DCCC is a collaborative organisation. It's not meant to be in its own sake, in its own space. It has a role which is to add value to its partner organisations. Now, the partners are those which cluster around central Melbourne, but also include the far-flung parts of Melbourne, if you like, the Western Hospital on one side, and the Austin Hospital and the Olivia Newton-John Cancer Centre on the eastern side, and also St Vincent's Hospital just outside the immediate Parkville area. And of course, it has all the major Parkville research and hospital entities in its partnership. So a fantastic organisation, and we're looking for really wonderful outcomes from facilitating research through collaboration, improving patient care, and in fact, as we were talking a little earlier, networking further beyond the current partnership across the whole of Victoria. So regional Victoria and the southern part of Melbourne are all part of a process to expand cancer research, improve cancer clinical care, and also, as perhaps this session is part of it, develop some innovative educational elements to improve understanding of cancer across our community. So that's the DCCC, and I'm absolutely delighted, and we are delighted that we have a very special visitor today who is going to start off this series of meetings. Professor Peter Boyle. Peter is an old friend of mine and many in this room. He's got strong links with Melbourne and Australia, but he's he's an international sort of polymath almost. He's a European. His strong links in the US. England we don't mention because when you hear his accent you realise that England's not a key part of his, don't worry about that, it's an in-joke. But he's been everything in epidemiology. He's an epidemiologist by trade, very close links to clinical programs. He's been the director of statistics and biomedical research in Milan, at the International European Institute of Oncology. He's been the director of IARC, and he's currently the director of an institute. He's named his International Prevention Research Institute, and he's a professor of global health within the Strathclyde University. The technicalities of this he might explain to us, but what you can see is he's across a huge area of action and interest in Europe particularly, but across the whole world also. So Peter's research is particularly in prevention, and he's going to talk to us today about prevention in a global sense. He's become very, very interested in the issues which affect the underprivileged countries I might just say that it's actually an area of real interest for the BCCC, because we live in such a privileged state in this country, and many of the Western countries. We have universal health care. We get treated for your cancer for virtually nothing, and we have very, very excellent cancer results and treatment. But just beyond our boundaries, it's awful. It's bad. So Peter's going to tell us about that. So with that, Peter, I'll ask you to come forward, and look forward to hearing you talk about globalisation of cancer prevention.
Thanks, Bob. Just to follow up on what he attributes me to my feelings towards England, there's a wonderful saying we learned in Scotland that the sun never sets on the British Empire. God knows better than to trust an Englishman in the dark. So, how do we get the slides to move forward? I don't apologise. Oh, okay. So, as voice check 1, voice check 2 is here. To tune you into the accent, there was a long time ago Disraeli and Gladstone were the leaders of 2 major political parties in Britain. They didn't like each other. And at a social gathering, Gladstone said to Disraeli, "I predict, sir, that you'll die either by hanging or of some vile disease." And Disraeli replied, "That depends, sir, upon whether I embrace your principles or your mistress." Disraeli was asked in Parliament to explain the difference between a misfortune and a calamity. And he said if Gladstone fell in the Thames, that would be a misfortune. And if anyone pulled him out, I suppose that would be a calamity. And that's the situation today in global public health. I'll come back to talk about that later on, but we've got a disastrous situation, and unless we do something about it now, it's going to be a major calamity. I'm going to talk about prevention. There's 4 pillars of oncology. The pillar is to prevent those cancers that can be prevented, to treat all the cancers that can be treated, to cure all the cancers that can be cured, and to provide palliation wherever palliation is required. The 4 pillars of oncology, and they all come down to prevention. We want to prevent people getting cancer. We want to prevent people getting advanced cancer, because people die of mainly from metastatic disease and advanced disease rather than local disease. We want to prevent people dying from cancer, and we want to prevent pain and suffering among cancer patients. So prevention runs through everything, although we'll talk about various aspects of this. I mainly focus on primary prevention, prevention of people getting cancer. One of the difficulties that we've got when you stand back and take a more global view, we're actually working in a cancer silo. And the cancer silo, we don't talk to the cardiovascular or the diabetes or the multiple sclerosis silos. And there's very little interaction between cancer advocates and, for example, cardiovascular disease advocates. We also fail to look at the lifespan, which is a distinct limitation. And in the large majority of instances, the recommendations for prevention have not been completely scientific based. And that's something that we've got to move on and do a lot of work to make any recommendations to have a scientific base. We've moved on from just looking at cancer to take a more broad view, and we've got a book that's going to be published in March this year called Guidelines for a Healthier and Longer Life. It's the most complete work on prevention to date, and it's completely scientifically based. And our objective is to make this scientific publication available without cost to the largest audience possible, including writing it again for the general public, which is quite difficult, but that's something we're in the process of doing just now. And for prevention, although we'll focus on cancer in this talk, prevention covers everything from vaccination in younger age through lifestyle choices of tobacco, alcohol, nutrition, physical activity, to recommendations. What do you recommend just now about cancer screening, which is a huge international issue at the present time? Do you screen people for diabetes, which is, again, a very open question? And there's a lot of information out there about chemo prevention or giving aspirin, vitamin D, etc. to prevent cancer, and we've got to look at the scientific basis of that. Is it worthwhile taking a statin? Is it worthwhile taking an aspirin? These are really good questions, and the scientific basis for most of them is really, for those two in particular, is really quite solid. But does prevention work? Well, here is the situation with acute myocardial infarction in the United States between 1967 and 2015. That's the last year we've got US mortality data. And although treatment has been limited since the mid-1960s, on the other hand, prevention through measurement and control of blood pressure, using antihypertensive medications, using cholesterol, and looking at statins and the use of aspirin has greatly increased since the mid-1960s. And the overall result is, in the United States since 1967, the mortality from myocardial infarction at all ages in men has gone from about 210 per 100,000 per annum down to about 25 per 100,000 per annum. A great success for prevention, and it was brought about not by treatment, but it was brought about mainly by control of the risk factors. Does cancer prevention work? Well, we were very much involved in the development of a thing called the European Code Against Cancer, started in 1985, and were responsible for the first revisions of it. And this was strongly supported by European Parliament directives on tobacco products, which we wrote with Nigel Gray, and advertising and population-based screening for cancer. The goal set up in 1985 was a 15% reduction in the number of cancer deaths by the year 2000. In the year 2000, based on the 1985 rates, we expected 1,033,000, and we estimated in the member states participating in 1985, there was 940,000 deaths from cancer, which was a decrease of 9%. In other words, 92,500 cancer deaths were avoided in the year 2000 by this program. So that's really quite interesting, because in 1985, when they set up the program, cancer rates were rocketing skywards, and we're in the middle of the development of the cancer epidemic. This gentleman, Thomas Adams, is not Scottish, though it sounds, but he's actually English. And he wrote in 1680 that prevention is better than healing because it avoids the labour of being sick. And that's something, sickness and suffering and death, premature death, is something which has got to be high in all our agendas. For World Cancer Day, which has just passed, the sort of underlying message for last year, this year and next year was, we can, I can. And this led to every group and every country doing their own thing. One of the common words that was used, the common phrases and actions, was unity. It was a common word used in many campaigns this year. And unity is something that's really quite important now, because as our knowledge has increased, our understanding of the proportion of cancers which can be attributable to various factors has been slowly declining. These are the estimates from Doll and Pito in 1981, published in the Journal of National Cancer Institute. You can see that tobacco, based on the data available up to then, 30% of cancer deaths in the United States could be attributed to tobacco, 3% to alcohol, 35% for diet, based on limited data. It turns out just now there's very little of cancer that can be prevented or attributed to diet. And you go down to the bottom, they guess 10%, but at that time no one even knew about hepatitis C, for example. It was non-A, non-B hepatitis at the time. And so we've had a huge improvement in our knowledge of infected processes in the last 20 years. That's probably the greatest contribution of epidemiology in cancer at the present time. So Pito's young brother, or his elder brother, I'm not quite sure, Julian Pito, published in Nature, and he tried to separate US cancer deaths by current smokers and non-smokers. So current smokers, 60% of cancer deaths in current smokers could be attributed to the smoking habit. And at the bottom, the overweight was the big issue. Say that non-smokers having a BMI of greater than 25 was the biggest single cause of cancer in non-smokers. And this set in train a whole series of issues, and the issues are really quite important. We came on to look at the attributable causes of cancer mortality in France in the year 2000. That's moving on. just a little bit. We published this in 2007. A quarter we could attribute to tobacco, 70% to alcohol. But when we split it up, a third of cancer in men could be attributable to tobacco and 10% nearly in women. Alcohol, 9.4% in men. They drink a lot of alcohol in France, 3% in women. One of the interesting, when you look at it, slightly different, if you get the publication, it's all there, that 10% of breast cancer in women was attributed to low-dose alcohol consumption. And that's an area that we've been working on ever since. But you see, as we come down to overweight and obesity, it's 1.3% in men and 2.3% in women. But overall, we only understand the causes of about 35 to 40% of human cancer. And that's an area that I think we've got to do a lot of work in. Here's the nice trends. We see these remarkable reductions in lung cancer now, mouth, pharynx. If you look back to the mid-1970s, cancer of the mouth was the commonest cause of cancer in men in France, and that's declined dramatically. And lung cancer has started to rocket down. So we're doing quite well in terms of death from cancer. We've made some sort of progress. There's still an awful lot of progress to be made. What we're seeing here, essentially, is the results that are attributable to the big change in cigarette smoking. Cigarette smoking is still a major issue. We calculate, well, Richard, Peter and I did this in a bar, a pub in Oxford one night after 4 or 5 pints. It's still quite valid. I've still got the bit of paper that about 150 million people around the world will die as a result of cigarette smoking in the first quarter of this century, 300 million in the second, and 1 billion overall, 500 million in the second half of the century, and 1 billion overall. And this is greater than the 100 million which died from tobacco in the 20th century. Huge epidemic. We're making huge progress in countries like Australia, United Kingdom, huge reduction in the prevalence of smoking, but that's outweighed by the huge increase in the prevalence of cigarette smoking in low-resource countries, particularly in Africa and Asia and China. I'm going to show one of the issues we spoke a little bit before about overweight and obesity. I'd ask you to look at 2 things on this. One is the pattern. This is the year up here. This is the pattern. And please look at the scale down below. So this is 1985, the obesity prevalence in the United States in 85. 1990, 1995, notice we've got a new scale point. 2000, a new scale point. 2005, a new scale point. In 2010, another new scale point. And if this is associated even with a small increase in cancer, this is going to be something which is going to play a dominant role in creating the incidence and prevalence of cancer in years to come. This is a recent publication in Lancet. Do I have a mouse? Yeah. So you can see here this is a reference point. We looked at BMI between 22.5 and 25 as the reference. And you go up here to 27.5 to 30, that's overweight, and there's a 20% increase in the risk of overall mortality. Once you go to 30 and over, 1.45, 1.94, 2.76 for the BMI greater than 40. But we take our eye off the other end. If you look at BMI 20 to 22.5, it's 1. We look at 18.5 to 20, it's 1.3. And if someone's got a BMI between 15 and 18.5, we've got a 50% increased risk of mortality. And this isn't because they're ill. This is taking all the data, measuring the BMI, excluding 5 years of follow-up, and then starting the clock. This is not due to the presence of disease. And that's an area we're all interested up here in the overweight and obesity issue, but I think we've taken our eye off the issue associated with being very much underweight. So there we are. This is the most sensible thing that anyone has said from the United States in many years, that there are known knowns. There are things that we know we know. We also know there are known unknowns. We know there are some things we do not know. But there are also the unknown unknowns, the ones we don't know, And that last one, we know enough to prevent, if we're 100% successful, about 1/3 of cancer in Western countries today. And it's the unknown unknowns. We don't know where to look for the next group where we can find the cause, find the association, find the cause, and take preventive actions. And that, I think, is one of the great advantages that you've got here. This is a magnificent development, not just the building. It's an essential advantage for interdisciplinary cancer research in a wide variety of relevant topics, including many aspects of prevention. We're not going to get much further forward just simply by an epidemiological approach to cancer control, to cancer risk factors and cancer prevention. And we need this multidisciplinary interaction to help us move forward and get a better understanding of what the causes of cancer are. One of the big threats that we're facing just now is the growth and ageing of the world's population. So this is the United States here, from population from 1950, every 5 years up until 2050, the projections. These are 5-year age group, 0 to 4, 5 to 9, up to 85 plus. You can see that in 1950, there was not so many elderly people. But as the century progressed, and this century will progress, there's a greying of the population. And we can see that in many countries with which we're familiar. We also see it in Europe. And you can see these big holes here caused by the two major wars of the last century. You can see that we've lost the big base. We've lost the base of younger people, and the population is getting, on average, older and older and older. And as we all know, the incidence of cancer, chronic diseases like diabetes, cardiovascular disease, they all increase quite dramatically with aging. What we didn't realize until recently is the situation in China. China has got a significant proportion of the world's population, and when you do the same graph for China, we go back, we'll get it back to 1950. This goes up not to 85 plus, it goes up to 100 plus. In 1950, there's very, very, very few elderly people. That's defining elderly as greater than 35. And you can see that there's been a dramatic greying of the population in China, really quite dramatic. Well, that's the same in quite a lot of these countries. This is the aging, this is the percentage of the elderly over 65 in China's population from 1950 to 2050. And it's going to go from 5% to leap up to about 23%. And with this will come an explosion in the number of chronic diseases. Every one of them is going to go up quite dramatically. And as we look around these tiger economies, you can see, for example, this is something which, sociologists, geographers, etc. use, the speed of population aging. And it's the number of years for the percent of population aged 65 or older to rise from 7% to 14%. Don't ask me why, but it's an index, it's accepted. In France, it took 115 years for this to happen. In Sweden, it took 85 years. In Australia, from 1938 to 2011, it took 73 years. In Singapore, it's going to happen in 19 years. Colombia, 20 years. Brazil, 21. China, 26 years. And Chile, 27 years. So there's sudden acceleration in the aging of the population in these economies which are developing quite rapidly. The consequence is that they're going to be swamped again by the tsunami of chronic disease at a much quicker rate than we've had to adjust in France, Australia, United States, Canada, and in the UK. Just to put it into perspective, I just remember one thing when we're talking about numbers. When we talk about the number of cases of cancer in the world and the number of cancer deaths, etc., these are just estimates based on estimates of estimates. But the best we can do, because we only know about the incidence of cancer in 9% of the world's population, and we know about the mortality from cancer in about 12% of the world's population. So we can see here that from 2008 to 2030, it's going to be quite a growth. It's going to go from 6.7 billion up to 8.3 billion in the world population. But you can see also that there's this aging bulge that's going to come through. The consequence is that these are the estimates of the global cancer burden from 1975 to 2080. The burden doubled between 1975 and the year 2000, and is going to increase dramatically through this aging process and the increase in the population up until 2030. The big issue is that we can see here, this just shows you the huge increase which is taking place in the estimates were all made in the same way, so they're equally bad, and for each point they're comparable, but huge increase is going to occur in the number of cases of cancer, in the number of cancer deaths, and the number of people living with cancer. And that's quite important. That's something we exclude, but we're going to go from 28 to 80 million people alive with cancer, and a lot of them will still be requiring treatment. And that's going to be very, very expensive, and it's going to involve the development of an infrastructure with personnel, the medical personnel, and all the resources to treat those cancers. The reason behind this increase, as I said, is the growth and ageing of the world population, but in the low resource countries in particular, the introduction of cancer risk factors from developed countries to add to those already existing in low and medium resource countries is going to be a major driver. There's a 30 to 40-year gap between a population with a big change in tobacco smoking and a big change in disease caused by tobacco smoking. And now we're about 20 to 25 years into that gap in Africa and in parts of Asia. And the one thing that we mustn't forget as we move on to 2030 is that we're going to be in a difficult position. There's 2030, 27 million new cases of cancer, 17 million cancer deaths, 75 million people with cancer. And what we mustn't forget is that these are people. And we can talk all day about statistics, but statistics are just patients with the tears wiped away. And that's something we should never, ever forget. We're dealing with a disease which is not a disease of rats or test tubes or mice. It's a disease which affects humans. It affects many humans. I'm sure there's not one person here who doesn't have a family member or a close relative who's had cancer, and when cancer strikes, it can strike really very, very hard. And when we think of that problem going on to the future, the cancer burden, we need to think of the treatment needs. We need to think of the costs of treatment, especially in low and medium resource countries. We're still faced with a huge burden of infection disease and a low budget for health. At the meeting of the presidents of African states about 3 years ago, there was an agenda item to increase the average per capita spending on health from $12 to $15, and it wasn't passed, but we'll live in hope. But most of all, we can't put out of our mind the human suffering that's associated with these statistics. When I was young, I used to write, start these papers with, oh, cancer is a disease of high resource countries, westernized countries, industrialized countries. And it wasn't until about this Lancet editorial in 2006 that we started to take the globalization of cancer seriously. And we expect that there's going to be a huge increase. But of those increasing numbers which we're going to see, the greatest effect of this increase will fall on low resource and medium resource countries, where in 2001 almost half of the disease burden was from non-communicable disease. We're just adding on to the disease in these countries. In the high resource countries, we've got commonest cancers are lung, colorectal, breast. In the low resource countries, it's cervix cancer, oral cancer, stomach cancer are unusually common. In high resource, 1/3 are caused by tobacco use, 10% by chronic infection. In the low resource countries, 1/3 are caused by chronic infection and 12%, but growing, caused by tobacco. And the cancer control priorities are really quite different in the high resource and the low resource countries. High resource countries' priorities are tobacco control still, high-tech screening for small tumours and curative treatment, whereas in the low resource countries, cancer control priorities include tobacco control, low-tech screening for downstaging, and treatment is frequently aimed at palliation. We forget, we all know about in low resource countries the global burden of TB, AIDS and malaria are the big killers, but we forget that in the world there's many more people die each year from cancer than from TB, AIDS and malaria combined. I'm not saying that we should ignore these, but I think we've got to pay much more attention and put the cancer burden into some sort of priority. We've been doing a lot of work in Africa, a lot of terrible things in Africa. 57% of the population of Uganda never see a health worker in their lifetime, and that's not only doctors, nurses, that's trained technicians, etc., etc. 57% in a survey that we conducted never see a health worker in their lifetime. Cancer prevents like this. Cancer in Africa doesn't present like the tiny tumours that we're so used to seeing in Western countries, but it eventually comes to Western medical attention after it's been through an unbelievable pathway which we don't really completely understand yet, but a lot of it involves traditional healers as the first point. This is a young boy, Alan. He was lucky that his mother cared and looked after him, just didn't, like most of them, exclude them from the household because they had cancer. And he's doing pretty well with good treatment they had in Kampala. This is how breast cancer presents in low-resource countries. We did surveys in Africa, and between 90 and 100% of breast cancer in the countries of Africa presents at stage 3 or stage 4. A cure is not an option, and it needs to be palliation. This was the National Cancer Institute in one of the countries in Asia, and this is how women came along with breast cancer. This was her presenting, and this was the day of her operation. We'll get huge problems. Most low and medium resource countries have limited access to radiotherapy, and over 30 African and Asian countries have no services at all. In Africa, the actual supply of radiotherapy is 1/5 of the current needs. If you exclude North Africa and South Africa, then there's more radiotherapy equipment in Melbourne than there is in the rest of Africa. Total global shortages in low and medium resource countries are over 7,000 radiotherapy machines, and accessible, affordable, suitable radiotherapy technologies. These are really a prerequisite for any cancer control strategy. Between 2000 and 2020, there was 260 million people in the world we estimate developed cancer, of which 150 million were in developing countries, of which 100 million were suitable for radiotherapy. In the majority of these cases, there was no radiotherapy available to treat these patients. This aging phenomenon is something that we've really got to get our heads around, because we're in a completely new era, an era we've never been in before. It's estimated that on Earth there's between 80 and 120 billion persons who've ever lived. The median age in the United States has increased quite dramatically. By 2080, it's projected there will be 1 million people aged over 100, and 2/3 of all seniors, those people who've reached the age of 65, 2/3 of all those people who've ever lived on Earth are alive today. That's something we've never seen before, we've never thought about, and we've really got to change our mindset in how we're going to cope with that and the resulting huge increases that we're going to see in many chronic diseases. We produced this report in 2014, The State of Oncology, and we looked at the whole situation around the world. It was really quite dramatic. The book was fundamentally different because there was a lot less of this and a lot more of this. This man is the driver and the chauffeur of Richard Sullivan every time he goes to India, which is he allowed us to use his photograph here. This is 1930 in the United States. This is a child with a little mark on their face going to be treated by radiotherapy. I think it's very poignant that you needed a machine this size to treat such a small thing in those particular. The kid must have been terrified. So thank God we made progress. But the real problem that we've got, we'll address for the next 10 minutes, is the situation in sub-Saharan Africa. It's experienced a rapid growth and aging of the population right now and into the foreseeable future. With increasing control of infectious disease and progress against HIV/AIDS, the burden of cancers and other non-communicable diseases will increase. I hate the word non-communicable disease. We talk about communicable disease and say measles is a communicable disease. Okay, you get it, and 2 weeks later you're better again. But cancer is a non-communicable disease, and people get the impression that, oh, yeah, okay, it's non-communicable, we just get it. But we forget that it really is a chronic disease. Once you've got it for life. And I think we've got to go back in our mind to think of more chronic disease rather than just a one-off non-communicable disease episode. This is radiotherapy machines in Africa. Each dot represents a machine. You can see that there's a lot of dots in North Africa, lots of dots in the country, the Republic of South Africa. And these countries in white don't have a single radiotherapy machine. And here you've got likes of Sudan, Ethiopia, Uganda, with one machine. And every time you go and visit, that machine isn't working. We saw this, made the BBC website, the 8th of April 2016. The national cancer machine broke in Uganda. They had one radiotherapy machine for the population of Uganda, and it broke. But you can look at the state of this. Look at this. I mean, this isn't a new phenomenon. This is something that's had problems, and they've never been able to get a new one. So there's a lot of debate. The government don't want to buy one. There's going to be 2 years before they get another, etc., etc. And there was a health minister appeared 2 weeks ago, and he was on gone to one of the websites, the BBC website, and he was quoted as saying, "We don't need another cancer machine. Everyone with cancer dies. What do we need one for?" And that's an attitude I think we've got to overcome. So there's 55 countries in the world without a machine, 30 countries in Africa, and there's also 29 countries in Africa where the importation of opioid drugs is forbidden. It's been a huge failure to change this situation despite the launch of many major international initiatives. I'd like to introduce you to Anne Merriman.
Every African who developed cancer would have odds in their favor. They would have the opportunity of receiving treatment and hopefully a cure. As we are discovering, the reality in Africa is far different.
Between 90 and 100% of women with breast cancer in Africa presented with stage 3 or stage 4 disease, advanced disease or metastatic disease, where cure is not an option and you've got to treat the symptoms and provide palliation.
Because the majority of people all over Africa, 50% of Africans never see a health worker. Now, if you go to a conference, the doctors speak as if everybody goes to the hospital, they don't. And people forget about the other people, and that's what really worries me. But in cancer in particular, less than 5% actually reach cancer therapy. And so 95% of them are going to die in the villages, usually without any pain control.
One way of really improving the quality of life, if one can really treat or cure the disease, is definitely to try to alleviate the pain.
Human rights watch say that doctors who don't treat pain when they know how to do it, and they have the drugs, are the same as torturers.
C'est indéniable, les gens meurent dans la douleur parce que s'il n'y a pas de morphine, il n'y a pas de morphine.
So if morphine is so important to cancer care, why is it still unavailable in over 50% of African countries?
There's 29 countries in Africa where it's legally forbidden to import opioid drugs.
I'm calling for them to allow morphine to be available for patients who need it.
The frustrating part of morphine availability in Africa is that it is not even an issue of cost. Morphine is than paracetamol or other over-the-counter pain medication.
The cost of morphine for 1 week is equivalent to the cost of 1 loaf of bread.
It was $1 for 10 days treatment when we first started, now $2 for 10 days treatment. We don't make money from the manufacturer, and we don't want to make money from it, because if we do, the price will go up, and that will stop that circular throughout the whole of Africa. When we came in first, we made it in the kitchen sink. It's easier to make it a cake or anything else. Okay, very easy to make.
If oral liquid morphine is so effective, affordable, and easy to manufacture, why is there such resistance to it in Africa?
When you prescribe it for a patient, the next day you find the patient has stopped taking it and say, oh, because the other person said I shouldn't take it, which is reserved for the end, I'll get addicted. We see it even in medical personnel. When you give them, they say, oh no, don't give me, I'm going to get addicted. But the attitude changes when people use it and then find that these things they anticipate don't really happen.
Exactly, yeah. Because of the low dose concentration that we have in the liquid, it is so low that it won't give you a high, it will only take away the pain.
The data is clear. Africa is by far the world's lowest consumer of morphine for medical purposes.
In terms of per capita morphine consumption, we are the lowest. I think we consume less than 1% of the morphine in the world.
Are African policymakers listening? Do they understand the importance of palliative care? For years, they clearly did not. But recently, with the efforts of civil society and the international community, they seem to be realizing that they have been ignoring a fundamental phase of the cancer journey.
What has happened to support what we are all working towards is the passing of the World Health Assembly Resolution on Palliative Care in 2014, which calls upon all governments to ensure that palliative care is part and parcel of their national health system.
One of those civil society advocates is a woman who some call Palliative Care's Mama Africa. Her passion and her organization's work have helped thousands to live their final days in dignity, pain-free, and surrounded by the love and compassion so important to us all.
The idea was to form an organization that would try and bring palliative care throughout Africa in an affordable way.
So we've now treated 27,000 patients on our program, and these 25,000 of those have been on all morphine. It's been no deprivation and no addiction registered since we started. And it's used in the home. They keep us in the home. The patient is told how to use it, the relatives are told how to use it. They get an extra dose of it, they get some pain, and it's working perfectly.
Hospice Africa Uganda, the Kampala-based organization founded by Anne Merriman, does more than offer palliative care to their patients. To ensure the model is replicated throughout the continent, they have set up a series of classes for Africa's caregivers.
The number of people who are wanting to train palliative care is a lot, but unfortunately, up to about 60% of them, although we have used them, are not able to raise fees.
Fortunately, many medical professionals are realizing the importance of palliative care and joining its ranks.
When I was joining palliative care, my colleagues here in Zambia Hospital, they told me it was suicide, it was career suicide. And I was like, okay, if it is career suicide, I'll go for it. And I found a lot of joy in palliative care.
The fact is that palliative care, notably oral liquid morphine when it is available, makes living with late-stage cancer manageable.
It is helping out because when I'm not on it, I don't feel how pain. When I have it, I function well.
I went to this particular patient to see her, and then the daughter started crying and said, please, don't see my mother, she hasn't reached that extent.
You can't interact with a patient who is in pain. And I'm not sure whether there is any relative who would like to see his own relative or her own relative rolling in pain.
It is, however, important to remember that palliative care is so much more than pain control. Patients and their families depend on palliative caregivers to give them holistic support. Love and compassion do indeed go a long way.
The care you give to the patient and their family, when the patient dies, family members will come back and thank. Come and thank us that thank you very much. You were there for us. And I think that is one of the most rewarding things for when the patient has passed on, family members then come back and thank us.
This is just an extract from a film that they made last year, which is, if you want a beta version, it's available on our website. But the whole issue of the state of oncology in Africa, that's the accompanying film for it, is that it presents a depressing and deplorable picture of the current situation regarding Africa on that continent. It's a unique report. It's written by health professionals working in Africa, or international colleagues working closely with Africa. It's going to be from the 28th. Right now, you can download it for free from our website. We don't charge for anything like this. But we've got to realise that the situation is bound to get worse as the population grows and ages, and cancer risk factors start to bite in, adding to the local risk factors with infections on top of the list. We've got to give a lot of credit to those professionals in Africa who are working with cancer. They're doing a magnificent job, mainly in absolutely desperate circumstances, without adequate resources or infrastructure, and they deserve our full respect, admiration and assistance. There's some remarkable successes. We showed you Anne Merriman. Anne used to be, she was a nun on the Medical Missionaries of Mary, and she went to Uganda at the height of the AIDS epidemic, and she was so appalled with the deaths that patients with AIDS were having that she actually went to the Minister of Health and President and virtually threatened them with eternal damnation or whatever she could threaten them with, until they allowed her to import powdered morphine. And she started mixing it up in milk bottles in 3 doses and sending it out to people's homes. There's extraordinary examples. However, they all rely on international charitable donations rather than governmental funding or structural funds from official development assistance. And that's quite a shocking state of affairs. This is a situation from Tanzania. Dr. Trish Scanlon, she was a consultant medical oncologist in Ireland who decided she wanted to go to work in the low-resource countries. Since her involvement in 2008, she now lives in Tanzania. She has arranged the training of a dedicated team of Tanzanian doctors and surgeons. The short-term survival rates of children with cancer went from 12% to 60%. And every single department in Boyle Hospital works with Our Lady's Children's Hospital, Crumlin Hospital in Dublin, to assist in this work. And this is a remarkable story of Felix.
So he came in July last year, and Felix had a kidney tumor called a Wilms tumor. It was in his left side. And when we did the ultrasound, and I wasn't here at the time, so it was the Tanzanian doctors who figured this all out. Basically, he had a tumor in his kidney, which had left his kidney, gone through his vessel all the way up through his liver and into his heart. And he had like a fist-sized tumor in his heart. And I would say, even a year ago, we wouldn't have been able to cure this boy. But there's a recently returned team of cardiothoracic surgeons who've just come back from 5 years training overseas. And what we did was we gave him chemotherapy to shrink everything down. And then we have a fantastic group of local surgeons here, general surgeons who do the pediatric oncology surgery for us. We also have a visiting expert who comes once a year who's an oncology surgeon from Ireland. And that team of Professor Martin from Ireland and Dr. Zantuni and her team from here teamed up with cardiothoracic surgeons. So in one sitting, this little boy has his belly open and his chest open, put on bypass. Here in Dar es Salaam, here in Wimbili, they took the tumor out of his kidney, or his kidney actually, and they took the tumor as much as they could out of the vessels. Then they opened his heart and took the tumor out of his heart. And then they closed him all up. And as you can see today, he's still on chemotherapy, but we sent all those tumor specimens to the lab and they were all dead. So he has a very sensitive tumor, so this little boy will be fine.
That's just a magnificent example of what you can do with international collaboration. The Crumlin Children's Hospital in Dublin, which is very famous, every department there works with the Boyle Hospital to help train, form, advance the treatment of childhood cancer there, and it's really been quite successful. The cover of our State of Oncology book is Jovia, who is we had a great pleasure to interview her, and her family were delighted with the interview and allowed us to use her picture. And Jovia is in Uganda, and she's one of the current patients. She was at that time one of the current patients with Anne Merriman in the Hospice Africa, Uganda. And this is the story of Jovia.
So we're going to visit Jovia. She's 20 years of age. She has full-blown HIV/AIDS and cervical cancer. She's become really ill in the last month. She's very near end of life. So the hospice has been visiting her very regularly to make sure that she's comfortable and peaceful, that she has enough morphine, food, and money for supplies. So we're here today with Rose Light, who is her main carer, and to check on her.
Yeah, my grandmother.
Your grandmother was named Jovia. And you were born here in Kampala?
Yeah. The lot of dust, fake houses, the lot of diseases, everything. So, but in me, I love Papa because I grown up from Kampala.
How old are you?
No. 29.
29.
Yeah.
And how old's your daughter?
Now she's becoming 14.
14.
Man, yeah.
What kind of cancer do you have?
I don't know exactly. I guess cervix.
Cervix cancer?
Yeah.
You're taking morphine?
Yeah, I'm taking morphine. It's good. Before getting over, and then getting, and before getting over, I call my friend here. They bring police. Yeah. I don't want to miss that. I don't want to miss everything if I don't want to miss you. I want to stay here looking after my child. Even to do some works because I'm still young. Yeah. I'm even to look after him. I should pay him. Even this exactly you school. Yeah. This medicine I have been very, very much. After 4 hours, I take 4 minutes, 4 minutes. So yeah, I can't go for that because I didn't know that I would get it that period. I thank you people to come praying for me to support me. And because I didn't know I would get it. That's never mine. And another is another one from my daughter. What I'm doing after them. I need to go. I will have someone who look after me. And you have someone who care for me next to you people. And you can leave me. My dad, I don't know. When I'm back, when I'm 4 years, she died my mom is very, very well.
For every Jovi in Africa whose end of life was helped enormously by the availability of oral morphine, for every one like that, there's 40,000 Africans who die every year in pain without the benefit of that. There's lots of problems in Africa still. In the West, we're doing remarkable progress. If you look around Melbourne, it's just wonderful. Surgery is less mutilating. Radiotherapy is less morbid, more effective. Chemotherapy is most effective. Nutrition in patients is improving. However, many patients in Africa do not have access to these modern therapeutic regimes for a variety of reasons, which encourage the growth of this disparity. In Africa, access to healthcare is a major problem. Cancer awareness is limited. Cultural barriers are plenty. Patients present with advanced disease and only present after they've been through the traditional healer, by and large, and waste a lot of time progressing from a lump, which could be cured, for example, in the breast, to advanced disease, where only palliation is possible. There are huge, huge problems, and there's some really good things happening in Africa, but it's all due to partnership and charity, and there's no organised government resources at play here. I don't know how many chemotherapy drugs are available in this institute, in this group of institutes. I'd imagine it's more than 2,000 or 3,000. If we look at availability of the most essential and necessary drugs in Africa, of nearly 600 drugs on the WHO 2015 list of essential medicines, 44 are chemotherapies, 44 used to treat cancer, 38 chemotherapies and 6 hormonal therapies. Only 37 countries in the African region subscribe to this essential medicine list. Half of them don't because they don't have any drugs. And in these 37 that contribute, instead of having 44 available therapies, the median number available is 15. A substantial number of cancer patients, therefore, do not have legal, affordable access to the very minimal anti-cancer therapies. It goes without saying that cancer can only be a treatable disease if the treatment is available. It's a shame that for many reasons it's not treatable, as the treatment is not available for logistic or financial reasons. The delivery of cancer chemotherapy in Africa is further hindered by widespread lack of healthcare professionals skilled in administering chemotherapeutic agents, access to laboratories for blood count analysis, etc., and effective antiemetic and supportive treatments. This is typical of Africa. Let me introduce you to my friend Leo Musamba. Leo is the only medical oncologist in the Queen Elizabeth Medical Centre in Blantyre in Malawi. He's the only oncologist for Malawi's 17 million population. There is no radiotherapy machine there to help him. There's no palliative care. And each day in his clinic, 6 days a week, he sees 100 cancer patients in his clinic. Medical oncologist in Melbourne, how many cancer patients does he see per day? My daughter's a medical oncologist, and she's lucky if she sees 8 new patients per day. This guy sees 100 every day. You can't get away from the fact that it's bad to have cancer, and it's worse to have cancer if you're poor. The gap between rich and poor, the highly educated, little educated, the north-south divide is substantial, and it's going to grow and grow and grow as far into the future as we can see. We need to make every cancer patient have access to, they must have access to the right treatment at the right time for their disease, and we're a terrible, terrible far way off that situation. For the developing countries, we need to destigmatize cancer and raise government and public awareness. Why do most women with breast cancer in Africa suddenly present with stage 4 disease at Western medical services? Because their family are sick of the smell of the tumour. That's what pushes them to come. And that shouldn't happen. That shouldn't happen today. We've got to dispel the myth equating cancer diagnosis with death. We've got to shift the 70-30% balance of palliation over cure. And we've got to prevent adoption of lifestyles and behaviours that cause cancer. Here's Jovia again. In that book, we've got an executive summary. It's available on our website. It's I just copied it down. And the bottom line is that we know there's a problem. We know there's a huge problem in Africa, and we're doing nothing about it. And the situation with cancer in Africa is critical now that global society, once again, does not react too slowly to a health crisis in Africa. If you go onto our website, www.i-pri.org, you'll see a call to action that's already signed up by over 3,000 people. And we're asking governments to do very simple things. We need to train more oncologists. We need to provide infrastructure. We need to have the drugs and treatment. We need to have radiotherapy. We need opioids for pain control. Since half of cancer is caused by chronic infection in Africa, we need infection control and vaccination programs. But more than anything else, we need universal health coverage. Every patient in Africa has got to pay for their drugs and every interaction with the health service. And it's families who scrape together, and frequently they don't have enough money for even the simplest protocol of chemotherapy in this country. We need to give them lots of help. We need to give them as much help as we can. That was the example of Crumlin. We've done a magnificent job in Tanzania. In summary, before 2006, it was in everyone's lips giving a talk that cancer is a disease of high-resource westernised countries. 2006 in The Lancet, it was published, The Globalisation of Cancer made a lot of people aware that cancer wasn't just restricted to high-resource countries. But now we've got to move ahead, accept the globalisation of cancer, and move ahead to the globalisation of cancer prevention. And it's clear that cancer prevention should now be considered a global necessity. The world's major cancer centres do an excellent job for the local community, but need to unite and reach out to populations which are less well off than they are. Unity is a word which is widely used in cancer control at the present time. The situation with cancer in Africa is critical, and as I said earlier, global society cannot once again react too slowly to an African health crisis. Prevention is better than healing, because it avoids the labour of being sick. Thank you very much for your attention. I've got some publicity for you, so you can look at the publicity file.
Well, thank you, Peter. Very challenging, stirring, very emotional presentation. I think we are pretty well over time. Peter will be around for a while after, so anyone wants to come and talk to him. And